Have you ever looked back at a version of yourself and felt like you were staring at a stranger, not because you changed naturally, but because something or someone slowly reshaped how you think, how you react, how you feel about your own reality? Maybe it didn't start with pain. Maybe it started with comfort. A conversation that felt unusually deep. A person who seemed to understand you before you even finished your sentences. A connection that felt almost too perfect. And if you're honest, there was a moment, small, quiet, almost invisible, when you began adjusting yourself, just a little, to keep that connection alive. You told yourself it was compromise. You told yourself it was growth. You told yourself it was love, or loyalty, or maturity. But what if that moment wasn't random? What if it was the beginning of a slow psychological shift, so subtle you never realized it was happening? Tonight, we're not exposing obvious villains. We're uncovering something far quieter. The silent manipulator never forces. They don't threaten. They don't shout. They guide, suggest, reshape slowly. And the most unsettling part? You often feel safe while it happens. Think back to a time when someone entered your life and everything felt easier. Conversations flowed. They laughed at the right moments. They seemed to mirror your humor, your fears, even your dreams. You felt seen, not just casually understood, but deeply understood. And when someone makes you feel seen, your brain relaxes. Psychology shows that emotional recognition lowers natural defenses. Your nervous system interprets familiarity as safety. So you open up. You share stories you normally keep hidden. You reveal insecurities you rarely admit out loud. And something subtle begins to happen. They listen closely, not just to your words, but to your emotional reactions. They learn what makes you feel guilty, what makes you feel proud, what makes you feel abandoned, what makes you seek approval. But at this stage, it still feels like connection, because nothing painful has happened yet. That's the genius of silent manipulation. It begins with emotional warmth, and warmth feels like home. Imagine this. You express an opinion. They agree, almost perfectly. You share a childhood experience. They reveal a similar one. You talk about your fears, and suddenly they seem to carry the same fears. At first, it feels magical. But psychologically, something important is happening. Mirroring creates accelerated trust. When someone reflects your personality back at you, your brain assumes shared identity, and shared identity equals safety. So you lean closer emotionally. You begin asking for their opinion more often. You start wondering what they think before deciding what you think. And you don't notice the shift because it feels natural. After all, isn't connection supposed to feel easy? But here's the quiet truth. Ease can be engineered. And when trust forms too quickly, your emotional boundaries never had time to form. At some point, a small disagreement happens. Nothing dramatic. Maybe they make a comment that feels slightly off. Maybe they question something you value. You feel a flicker of discomfort. But then they soften their tone. They say, "I'm only saying this because I care." And suddenly, your discomfort feels selfish. So instead of questioning them, you question yourself. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe they're right. Maybe I misunderstood. And slowly, you begin editing your reactions. You become more cautious about expressing disagreement. You avoid topics that create tension. You adapt, not because you were forced, but because you want harmony. And in that moment, the silent manipulator learns something powerful. Your desire to keep the emotional connection outweighs your desire to protect your own boundaries. Here's something many people never realize. Manipulation rarely feels like control. In the beginning, it feels like closeness, but closeness can become leverage. They start offering subtle guidance. "You'd probably feel better if you did this. I just think you deserve more than your friends give you. I don't know. Sometimes people take advantage of you." At first, these statements feel supportive, but slowly they begin influencing how you see others. You start trusting their perspective more than your own. And something shifts internally. You begin checking your decisions against their approval. Not consciously, just quietly. Automatically, your emotional compass starts recalibrating around them. And one day, you realize something strange. You hesitate before making a choice because you're imagining their reaction. That's not force, that's internalized influence. And it happens slowly enough that you barely notice. Eventually, small emotional inconsistencies appear. They might withdraw slightly after disagreements. They might become quieter, colder, distant. Nothing dramatic, just enough to create discomfort. And your brain starts connecting patterns. When I agree, they're warm. When I disagree, they become distant. So naturally, you begin choosing harmony, not because you were told to, but because emotional withdrawal feels like loss. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement. Unpredictable emotional rewards create stronger attachment than constant kindness, and you begin working harder emotionally. To maintain closeness, you become more agreeable, more adaptable, more careful, but something else is happening beneath the surface. You're slowly abandoning parts of yourself without realizing. And then, one day, a small moment shakes you. Maybe a friend says, "You don't sound like yourself anymore." Maybe you reread old messages and notice your tone has changed. Maybe you catch yourself apologizing for something that never used to feel wrong, and for a brief moment, clarity appears. You notice the pattern. You notice the emotional shifts. You notice how often you silence your instincts to preserve peace. And the realization is quiet but powerful. This didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, layer by layer, conversation by conversation, adjustment by adjustment, and for the first time, you start asking a dangerous question. When did I stop trusting my own voice? But awareness is uncomfortable, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Tonight, you discovered something unsettling. Control doesn't begin with domination. It begins with emotional comfort. It grows through trust, through subtle guidance, through small internal adjustments. And by the time you recognize the shift, your emotional reactions may already be shaped. But what you've seen so far is only the surface, because the next layer is far more disturbing. What happens when manipulation doesn't just influence your behavior, but starts rewriting your memories, your perception, your version of reality? Next, we uncover the tactic that makes you doubt your own experiences, the tactic that makes you question what really happened and what you only think happened. And once you understand it, you'll begin to recognize moments from your past that suddenly feel different, because the silent manipulator's most powerful tool is not control over your actions, it's control over your reality. And that is where the real story begins. Last time, you began to notice something unsettling. Not loud control, not obvious pressure, but subtle emotional shifts, quiet adjustments, small compromises that slowly changed how you showed up in your own life. And maybe, after listening, you replayed moments in your head. Conversations that once felt normal, suddenly felt different. Reactions you once ignored, suddenly felt heavy. Memories you trusted started to feel uncertain. Because once you begin seeing manipulation, the next question appears almost automatically. What if my memories aren't as reliable as I thought? Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling sure about what happened, only to be told later that you misunderstood everything? Have you ever been told, "That's not what I said. You're remembering it wrong. You're being dramatic"? That never happened. At first, you dismiss it. Everyone misremembers things sometimes, but slowly, quietly, a strange shift begins. You stop trusting your own recollection. You start replaying conversations over and over, searching for proof that your experience was real. And eventually, you begin asking a terrifying question. Is my memory broken, or is something else happening? Tonight, we step into one of the most disorienting psychological tactics ever used. Not force, not shouting, but a slow distortion of your internal reality. This is gaslighting, and it doesn't start by erasing your memory. It starts by planting doubt. Imagine a small disagreement. Nothing dramatic. Just a conversation where something felt slightly hurtful. You remember the tone clearly. You remember the words. You remember how your stomach tightened when they spoke. Later, you bring it up gently, and they respond with confusion. "I never said that. You're exaggerating. You always twist things." At first, you feel defensive. You're sure of what happened, but they speak calmly, confidently, without hesitation, and something inside you pauses. Maybe I misunderstood. Your brain naturally trusts confidence. When someone presents their version of reality with certainty, your nervous system begins recalculating. You replay the memory. You analyze your own reactions. And instead of asking, "Why did they say that?" you begin asking, "Why did I react that way?" That's the first seed. Not rewriting your memory yet, just weakening your confidence in it. Human memory is not a recording device. It's a reconstruction. Every time you recall an event, your brain rebuilds it using emotion, context, and suggestion. And when someone repeatedly tells you that your perception is wrong, your brain begins updating the memory to reduce internal conflict. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance reduction. Your brain wants harmony, so when two realities clash, your memory and their confident denial, your mind searches for compromise. Maybe the tone wasn't that harsh. Maybe the words were different. Maybe I misunderstood the intention. And each time you revise the memory slightly, your internal certainty fades. But here's the quiet danger. Gaslighting doesn't require you to forget the truth immediately. It only requires you to stop trusting your own perception. After several moments like this, you begin to feel something unfamiliar. Hesitation before speaking. You double-check your thoughts before confronting issues. You rehearse your memories repeatedly. You begin saying phrases like, "I might be wrong, but maybe I misunderstood. I don't remember clearly." And the manipulator reinforces this uncertainty subtly. They might say, "You're very emotional. You tend to overthink. You imagine things sometimes." Notice, they're not directly attacking your memory. They're reshaping your identity. You're no longer a person with valid perception. You're becoming someone unreliable. And when you internalize that identity, your brain starts filtering experiences through self-doubt automatically. You begin pre-gaslighting yourself. You question your reactions before anyone else does. And that's when the tactic becomes powerful. Because now, they don't have to argue much. Your mind does the work for them. Gaslighting becomes more effective when combined with emotional warmth. After a confusing argument, they may suddenly become affectionate. They reassure you. "I just want us to understand each other. You know I care about you. I hate when we fight." This emotional closeness softens your internal resistance. Your brain associates their version of reality with emotional safety. So when they gently suggest, "Maybe you're just stressed lately. Maybe your memory is affected by your anxiety," you accept the explanation, not because it's true, but because it feels comforting. Over time, you begin relying on them as a reference point. You ask, "What really happened? Did I react too strongly? Was I being unfair?" And slowly, your internal compass shifts outward. You begin outsourcing your perception. And one day, something unsettling happens. You experience an event and immediately wonder how they will interpret it. Before forming your own understanding, you wait for theirs. Your reality starts forming around their narrative. The emotional consequences are subtle, but deep. You feel anxious, even in calm situations. You feel confused, even during simple conversations. You feel exhausted from constantly second-guessing yourself. You begin apologizing more often. You say sorry for reactions you once considered normal. You feel guilty for emotions you once trusted. Friends might notice changes. You seem unsure lately. You over-explain everything. You keep questioning yourself, but you might defend the manipulator because in your mind they are the stable one, the logical one, the calm voice in the chaos. And that's the paradox of gaslighting. The person creating confusion becomes your source of clarity. Until one day, a moment breaks the illusion. Maybe you find old messages. Maybe you recall a conversation exactly as it happened. Maybe someone else witnessed the event and confirms your memory. And suddenly, two realities collide, your memory and the story you were taught to believe. And for a moment, clarity returns. But clarity brings fear, because if your memory was correct, then the confusion wasn't accidental. Awareness doesn't arrive like a dramatic explosion. It arrives quietly. You start noticing patterns, how often your memory is questioned, how often your reactions are reframed, how often you feel uncertain. After conversations that once felt clear, you begin trusting small instincts again. You write things down. You observe emotional shifts. You listen to your internal voice before seeking external validation. And slowly your perception stabilizes. But something unexpected happens. As your clarity grows, tension increases. Because silent manipulators rely on confusion to maintain influence. And when confusion fades, control weakens. So they may intensify denial. They may accuse you of changing. They may say you're becoming distant. You're overanalyzing everything. You're turning against me. And you face a new internal conflict. Trust your regained perception, or return to the familiar comfort of doubt. Tonight, you uncovered one of the most disorienting psychological tactics. Gaslighting does not erase memory overnight. It introduces doubt, reshapes identity, and slowly shifts your trust away from yourself. But what you discovered raises a deeper question. If your perception can be reshaped, what happens when emotional dependence is added to the equation? What happens when someone doesn't just influence your memories, but becomes the person you rely on for emotional stability? Because in the next layer, we enter a far more dangerous territory. Dependency disguised as care, the phase where manipulation feels like protection and control feels like safety. And by the time you recognize it, you may already believe you need them to function, because the silent manipulator's most powerful move is not making you doubt reality. It's making you believe you can't survive without their version of it. And that is where our story goes next. Now, something unsettling became clear. Your memories, your reactions, your perception could be quietly reshaped through doubt. And maybe, after listening, you noticed how often you apologized for things you didn't fully understand. How often you questioned yourself before questioning someone else. But there is a deeper layer, and it feels warmer. Because after confusion comes something that looks like comfort. Have you ever felt like there was one person who understood you better than anyone else? One person who reassured you when you doubted yourself, who told you they would always be there, who made you feel protected from a world that suddenly seemed confusing. And slowly, you began turning toward them, not just for support, but for stability. It didn't feel like control. It felt like safety. It felt like someone holding your hand while everything else felt uncertain. Tonight, we step into a dangerous transformation, the moment when care becomes dependence, when emotional rescue becomes emotional reliance, when comfort becomes a quiet form of control. Because the silent manipulator doesn't only weaken your confidence, they position themselves as the only place you feel steady. And the most frightening part, you often feel grateful while it happens. After periods of emotional doubt, you naturally seek reassurance. You crave someone who says, "You're not crazy. I understand you. You can trust me." And the manipulator steps forward gently. They listen patiently. They validate your feelings selectively. They comfort you, especially after moments of confusion they helped create. And your nervous system relaxes, because when someone reduces anxiety, your brain associates them with relief. Relief feels like safety. Safety creates attachment. Soon, you begin sharing more with them than with anyone else. Your fears, your frustrations, your vulnerabilities. and they respond with phrases that sound protective. I'm the only one who really gets you. Other people don't understand your depth. You don't need anyone else when you have me. At first it feels like loyalty, but slowly your emotional world narrows. You start pulling away from other perspectives, not because you were told to, but because you feel safer staying close to them. Human attachment is built through emotional regulation. When someone repeatedly calms your anxiety, your brain begins to rely on their presence to maintain stability. Neuroscience shows that emotional relief creates powerful bonding chemicals. The more you associate someone with comfort, the more your nervous system learns, I feel better when they are near, and this is where subtle dependency begins. You start messaging them first when something happens. You wait for their response before forming conclusions. You feel uneasy when they are unavailable. They might say, I worry about you. I just want to keep you safe. I know what's best for you. And because they previously helped you during moments of confusion, their guidance feels trustworthy. Your decisions begin aligning with their approval, not through pressure, through emotional reliance. And slowly you forget how to self-soothe without their input. Dependency does not feel like weakness. It feels like closeness. You begin checking in with them constantly. Do you think this is a good idea? Should I talk to them? Was I wrong earlier? And when you act independently, subtle tension appears. They may sound disappointed. You didn't tell me first. I thought we trusted each other. I worry when you make decisions alone. Nothing overtly controlling. Just enough to make you feel guilty for independence. So you begin pre-consulting them to avoid emotional distance, and your internal voice becomes quieter, because it feels easier to rely on their guidance than to face uncertainty alone. But beneath the surface, another shift happens. Your self-confidence begins fading, not dramatically, just slowly. Dependency strengthens when isolation increases. They may subtly question others around you. Your friends don't really understand you. Your family stresses you out. I hate seeing people hurt you. These statements feel protective, but they reshape your perception of your support system. You begin trusting their interpretation more than your own experiences. Your world becomes smaller, more centered around them. And they reinforce your reliance by offering solutions. I'll help you handle that. Let me deal with it. You don't have to face things alone. At first, it feels like support. But gradually, your autonomy shrinks. You stop solving problems independently. You stop trusting your instincts. And one day you realize you feel anxious making decisions without consulting them first. That's not just attachment, that's conditioned dependence. Then something subtle but painful emerges. Moments when they withdraw. Maybe they become distant after you assert independence. Maybe they respond slower when you make decisions without them, and you feel a deep fear. What if I lose their support? Because your nervous system now associates them with emotional stability. So you begin working harder to maintain closeness. You reassure them. You seek approval more often. You avoid behaviors that might create distance. And internally you feel torn. Part of you senses something is off. But another part whispers, they're the only one who understands me. And this internal conflict becomes exhausting. Because dependence feels safe, but also strangely limiting. Awareness begins quietly. Maybe you notice how anxious you feel when they don't respond immediately. Maybe you realize you hesitate to make simple decisions alone. Maybe someone else asks, when was the last time you trusted your own judgment without asking them? And that question lingers. You start observing patterns, how often you defer to them, how often you avoid independence, how often you feel incapable without their reassurance. And slowly, a new understanding emerges. This isn't just care, it's reliance, reinforced through comfort, and awareness brings mixed emotions. Relief, because you see the pattern. Fear, because breaking dependence feels like losing safety. But you begin small steps, making one decision alone, sitting with discomfort, without seeking immediate reassurance, listening to your internal voice again. And with each step, your confidence grows quietly. Tonight, you uncovered a powerful shift. Care can become dependence. Support can become control. Comfort can become a cage built from reassurance. And you may begin asking a new question. If someone becomes your emotional anchor, what happens when they start rewarding you for obedience and withdrawing affection when you resist? Because in the next episode, we step into one of the most conditioning-based tactics of all: reward, punishment, and emotional training, the phase where approval becomes currency and your behavior begins changing, not through force, but through emotional reinforcement, because the silent manipulator doesn't just want your trust or your dependence. They want your patterns, your habits, your automatic reactions, and once your behavior becomes predictable, control becomes effortless, and that is where the next layer begins. Now you began to see something deeply unsettling. Care can quietly become dependence. Support can slowly become emotional reliance. And the person who comforts you can become the person you feel unable to function without. But there is another layer, and it's even harder to recognize. Because it doesn't feel like control. It feels like connection. Have you ever noticed how certain behaviors seem to bring you closer to someone, while other behaviors created distance? How certain words made them warm, affectionate, present, while other words, even small ones, led to silence, coldness, or subtle withdrawal. At first, you told yourself it was normal. Everyone has moods. Everyone reacts differently. But slowly, something began to change inside you. You started adjusting your behavior, not because you were told to, but because you learned which version of yourself received warmth and which version received distance. Tonight, we step into one of the most powerful psychological conditioning systems ever used in relationships. Not punishment in the obvious sense, not reward in the obvious sense, but a quiet training loop built from emotional reactions, a system where approval becomes a reward and distance becomes a silent consequence. And by the time you recognize it, your behavior may already be changing automatically. Ye manani, ade, dinzadai, yegi, yi, tashi. At the beginning, emotional reactions feel natural. You say something supportive, they smile warmly. You agree with their perspective, they become affectionate. You align with their preferences, the connection deepens. It feels like harmony, but then small moments appear. You disagree, and the atmosphere shifts. They become quieter, slower to respond, emotionally distant. No argument, no confrontation, just absence. And absence feels heavy. So next time you soften your tone, you choose your words carefully, you avoid triggering the distance again, not consciously, just instinctively. And without realizing it, you begin learning. Warmth follows agreement, distance follows independence. Behavioral psychology shows that humans adapt quickly to patterns of reward and withdrawal. When positive emotion follows a specific action, the brain records it as successful behavior. When emotional discomfort follows an action, the brain reduces that behavior to avoid pain. And when rewards are inconsistent, why were they distant today? What version of me brings closeness? And slowly, you begin editing yourself to maintain emotional warmth, not because you were instructed, but because your nervous system learned through repetition. As conditioning deepens, you begin noticing something strange. Your reactions feel less natural. Before speaking, you pause. You ask yourself, will this upset them? Will this create distance? Will I lose the warmth I need? You start avoiding topics that once felt normal. You soften opinions. You silence disagreements. You become more agreeable. And they may reinforce this subtly. You're so easy to talk to when you're calm. I love this version of you. Why can't we always be this peaceful? And without realizing it, you begin associating your authentic self with conflict and your adapted self with love. This creates deep internal tension, because part of you misses your unfiltered voice, but another part fears losing connection if you return to it. The most powerful form of emotional conditioning is silence. Not yelling, not criticism, just withdrawal, messages unanswered, eye contact reduced, energy shifted, and you begin working harder to restore warmth. You apologize. Even when unsure why, you offer reassurance, even when confused. You adjust behavior, hoping for emotional reconnection. And when warmth returns, it feels like relief. Your brain associates compliance with emotional reward. Over time, your nervous system learns. Harmony requires adaptation. Connection requires self-editing. And one day, you realize you're performing a version of yourself designed to keep emotional peace. Not because you were forced, because you were trained. Eventually, exhaustion appears. You feel anxious before conversations. You rehearse responses in your head. You overanalyze emotional tone. And sometimes you feel invisible because the version of you that receives love is not fully you. But breaking the pattern feels terrifying because emotional withdrawal feels like abandonment. And your nervous system, now conditioned to fear distance, urges you to return to familiar behaviors. So you continue adapting until a moment breaks through. Maybe you express a genuine opinion and feel relief, even if it creates tension. Maybe you notice how quickly your mood depends on their approval. And for a moment, you see the system clearly. Love should not feel like a training program. Awareness begins with small observations. You notice when warmth follows compliance. You notice when silence follows authenticity. You notice how often you anticipate emotional reactions before speaking. And slowly, you experiment. You express a minor disagreement without apologizing. You allow silence without rushing to fix it. You observe rather than react. And something surprising happens. The emotional patterns become clearer. You see how approval is given selectively, how distance is used strategically, and this awareness restores a piece of your autonomy. You begin reconnecting with your internal voice, not loudly, just quietly, decision by decision, reaction by reaction. But awareness introduces a new challenge, because when conditioning weakens, manipulators often escalate their tactics. Tonight, you uncovered how emotional reactions can quietly train behavior. Warmth becomes a reward. Silence becomes a consequence. And over time, your authentic self may shrink in exchange for emotional safety. But what happens when conditioning is combined with identity erosion? What happens when someone doesn't just shape your behavior, but slowly reshapes how you see yourself, your worth, your confidence? Because in the next episode, we enter one of the deepest layers of silent manipulation, the slow erosion of identity, the phase where you begin forgetting who you were before the conditioning began. And when that happens, control is no longer external, it becomes internal. And that is where the next chapter begins. Now you saw something deeply uncomfortable. Warmth could become reward. Distance could become punishment. And slowly, without noticing, your behavior could begin adapting just to maintain emotional closeness. But today, we move into a quieter transformation, one that doesn't feel like pressure, one that doesn't feel like conditioning. It feels like growth, like maturity, like becoming more understanding, more flexible, more calm. Have you ever looked back at old photos, old messages, old memories, and felt like you were looking at a different person? A version of you that was more expressive, more spontaneous, more certain? And instead of feeling proud of how much you've changed, you felt a strange emptiness, as if pieces of you had slowly faded, not suddenly, not dramatically, just quietly. Tonight, we step into the silent erosion of identity, the process where your values, your boundaries, your voice slowly shift until you no longer recognize your own reflection. And the most unsettling part? You may believe the change was entirely your own decision. Identity erosion never begins with dramatic transformation. It starts with small accommodations. You soften an opinion. To avoid conflict, you change a preference to maintain harmony. You silence a reaction because you don't want tension. And at first, these adjustments feel harmless. You tell yourself, I'm just being more understanding. I'm learning to compromise. I'm growing. But each small adjustment leaves a tiny emotional trace. A quiet discomfort, a subtle disconnect from your natural reactions. And when these adjustments are reinforced by emotional warmth, they begin repeating automatically. You start asking fewer questions, expressing fewer disagreements, showing less of your original energy, not because you were forced, because adaptation felt easier. Identity is shaped through repetition. The more you behave in a certain way, the more your brain updates your self-image to match that behavior. If you repeatedly silence your opinions, your brain begins seeing you as someone who is naturally quiet. If you repeatedly prioritize someone else's needs, your brain begins seeing you as someone who exists primarily for others. And when external feedback reinforces this new version, you're so much calmer now. You've become more agreeable. I like this new you. Your internal narrative shifts further. You begin believing that your previous identity was flawed, too emotional, too loud, too independent. And slowly, you distance yourself from who you once were, not because you were rejected, but because you were rewarded for changing. As identity shifts, internal tension begins rising. You notice moments when your authentic reaction tries to surface, a sudden frustration, a spontaneous idea, a strong opinion, but before it fully emerges, another voice interrupts. Stay calm, don't cause problems, be the better person. And you suppress the reaction. Not consciously, just automatically. You begin filtering your personality through emotional safety, and over time, something feels missing. You struggle to answer simple questions. What do I actually want? What do I really believe? What used to excite me? Your preferences feel blurred because your internal compass has been slowly redirected toward maintaining harmony instead of expressing authenticity. The deepest layer of identity erosion is internalized criticism. You begin hearing their voice inside your own thoughts. Before making decisions, you anticipate their reaction. Before expressing feelings, you imagine their judgment, and eventually you correct yourself before they need to. You might think, that's too dramatic, that's selfish, that's unnecessary. But the tone feels familiar because over time, their perspective has merged with your internal dialogue. And this is the moment when manipulation becomes internalized. You no longer need external pressure. Your own thoughts enforce the new identity, and the most painful realization appears slowly. You don't know where their expectations end, and your authentic self begins. Then a moment of contrast occurs. Maybe you meet someone from your past who reminds you of who you used to be. Maybe you rediscover an old passion and feel a sudden spark of recognition. Maybe you read old messages and notice a version of yourself that felt more alive, and you feel grief. Grief for the parts of you that quietly faded. You feel anger, but also confusion, because you can't pinpoint exactly when the change happened. There was no single moment, just 1,000 small adjustments. And with that realization, another emotion appears, fear. Because reclaiming identity means confronting discomfort. It means risking emotional distance. It means facing uncertainty without the safety of adaptation. And your nervous system, trained to preserve harmony, resists change. Awareness begins through gentle self-observation. You notice moments when you filter your reactions. You notice when you seek approval before expressing yourself. You notice when you abandon preferences to avoid tension, and slowly you experiment. You express a small opinion, honestly. You revisit an old interest quietly. You allow yourself to feel without immediate self-correction, and something unexpected happens. Your internal voice grows stronger, not loudly, but steadily. You begin recognizing the difference between adaptation and authenticity, and you start rebuilding identity, piece by piece, not by rejecting connection, but by restoring your relationship with yourself. Tonight, you uncovered one of the deepest transformations silent manipulation creates. Not control through force, not behavior through punishment, but identity reshaped slowly until you forget your original voice. And now, a new question emerges. What happens when identity erosion combines with emotional withdrawal? What happens when, after you begin reclaiming yourself, you suddenly face distance, silence, or isolation? Because in the next layer, we step into one of the most destabilizing experiences after awakening, the loneliness that follows clarity, the phase where you begin seeing the patterns, but feel more alone than ever before. And this is where many people return to old dynamics, not because they want control, but because they fear emotional emptiness. And that is where our journey goes next. Now, you began rediscovering something powerful. Your identity, your voice, the parts of yourself that slowly faded, and the quiet strength it takes to bring them back. But awareness comes with a cost. Because once you start seeing patterns, you can't unsee them, and something unexpected happens. The warmth that once felt comforting now feels complicated. The conversations that once felt safe now feel heavy. The silence that once felt peaceful now feels empty. Have you ever realized something about a relationship or a dynamic and suddenly felt more alone than ever before? Not because people disappeared, but because your perception changed. You begin noticing subtle emotional reactions, unspoken expectations, invisible patterns, and instead of feeling empowered, you feel disconnected. Tonight, we step into the quiet aftermath of awakening, the phase where clarity creates distance, where awareness feels isolating, where loneliness whispers, maybe things weren't that bad, maybe you should go back. And this is where many journeys stall, not because awareness was wrong, but because loneliness can feel heavier than control. When you first recognize manipulation, there's often a surge of strength. You feel alert, you feel insightful, you feel capable of protecting yourself. But after the initial realization, something else arrives. Silence. You begin stepping back emotionally. You stop reacting automatically. You observe more, speak less, and people notice the change. Some ask, "What's wrong with you?" Others seem distant, uncomfortable with your new boundaries, and slowly the familiar emotional rhythms disappear. The constant messages, the intense conversations, the predictable emotional exchanges, and in their absence, you feel a strange emptiness. Because your nervous system had adapted to those rhythms, even if they were unhealthy, and without them, you feel untethered. Human connection creates neurological patterns. When you're used to intense emotional engagement, your brain becomes accustomed to stimulation, even if that stimulation included tension or confusion. So when you step away from the dynamic, your nervous system enters withdrawal. Not just emotional, but biological. The absence of familiar interaction triggers discomfort. Your brain searches for what it knows, even if what it knows wasn't healthy. And loneliness begins to whisper. At least when things were complicated, you weren't alone. At least someone needed you. At least you felt connected, even if it was painful. This is why awakening feels paradoxical. You gain clarity, but lose familiarity. You gain independence, but lose emotional intensity. And the silence feels louder than you expected. During this phase, your thoughts may become conflicted. Part of you feels proud for recognizing unhealthy patterns, but another part misses the closeness, the attention, the emotional intensity. You may replay old memories, focusing on the good moments, the laughter, the warmth, the deep conversations. And your mind begins minimizing the discomfort, the confusion, the emotional pressure. You wonder, maybe I overreacted, maybe I misunderstood, maybe I should reconnect just to feel close again. And this internal debate becomes exhausting because loneliness amplifies nostalgia, and nostalgia can blur reality. But what you're experiencing is not weakness, it's emotional withdrawal, a natural response when breaking away from intense psychological bonds. Silent manipulators often anticipate this phase. They may reappear with kindness, warmth, nostalgia, a message saying, "I miss how we used to talk," a reminder of shared memories, inside jokes, emotional moments, and your heart responds immediately because your nervous system remembers the comfort. But now, your awareness sees the pattern, and you feel torn between emotional familiarity and psychological clarity, between longing and self-protection. And this is the moment where many people return, not because they want control, but because they fear emotional emptiness. Because loneliness can feel more painful than confusion. Eventually, you reach an emotional crossroads. You realize that returning to the old dynamic may temporarily reduce loneliness, but it may also revive the patterns you worked so hard to understand. And staying away feels uncertain, quiet, sometimes unbearably empty. You begin questioning yourself again. Am I too distant now? Am I overthinking everything? Am I pushing people away because I'm afraid? And during this period, emotional vulnerability is high. You may feel disconnected from friends who don't fully understand your internal journey. You may feel isolated, even in crowded spaces, because awakening is often an internal process, invisible to others. But slowly, something begins shifting. You start discovering moments of peace within the quiet, moments where you feel grounded without external validation, moments where loneliness transforms into solitude. As time passes, you begin building new forms of connection that doesn't rely on emotional intensity, connection that respects boundaries and authenticity. You learn to sit with silence without interpreting it as abandonment. You rediscover hobbies, interests, passions that reconnect you with yourself. And most importantly, you begin developing internal stability, the ability to self-soothe, to process emotions without immediate external reassurance. And slowly, loneliness becomes less threatening because you realize solitude is not emptiness, it's space. Space for healing, space for reflection, space for rebuilding without pressure. And with each small step, your emotional independence strengthens, not as isolation, but as resilience. Tonight, you faced one of the most difficult phases after awakening, the loneliness that follows clarity, the silence that replaces emotional chaos, the temptation to return just to feel connected again. But what happens when silence doesn't stay silent? What happens when, after you begin rebuilding independence, the manipulator escalates their tactics? When guilt, obligation, and emotional pressure suddenly increase, trying to pull you back into the old dynamic. Because in the next layer, we uncover one of the most powerful comeback strategies used by silent manipulators: guilt, emotional responsibility, and the illusion that you are hurting them by protecting yourself. And this is where many awakenings are tested, not through loneliness, but through emotional pressure. And that is where the next chapter begins. You thought waking up would make you free. Instead, it made you feel like the villain. Not because you hurt anyone, not because you lied, not because you betrayed trust, but because you finally said one dangerous word: no, and suddenly you were selfish, cold, ungrateful, dramatic, changed. Or worse, you're hurting me. So you started asking yourself a question that quietly destroys strong people. What if protecting myself makes me the bad person? If you've ever felt that sharp twist in your chest after setting a boundary, if you've ever apologized for needing space, if you've ever returned to someone simply to stop feeling guilty, then this episode is not just a story, it's a mirror. Because today, we step inside the guilt trap, the invisible cage that keeps awakened people walking back into emotional prisons, long after they found the door. And the most dangerous part? You don't even realize the trap was built long before you woke up. Awakening is not peaceful. It is not empowering, not at first. It is lonely, confusing, disorienting, because when you finally see manipulation, you also see your own silence, your own compliance, your own forgiveness repeated again and again. And somewhere deep inside you, a voice whispers, "If I had been stronger, this wouldn't have happened." That voice is not truth. It is conditioning. Many quiet, empathetic, thoughtful people were trained from childhood to carry emotional responsibility that never belonged to them, to smooth tension, to keep peace, to anticipate needs, to minimize their own discomfort. So when they finally stop, when they step back, their nervous system doesn't interpret it as safety. It interprets it as abandonment, not abandonment of others, abandonment of their assigned role, and guilt arrives instantly. But guilt doesn't just appear randomly. It is often activated, intentionally or unconsciously, by people who benefited from your self-sacrifice. And the way they do it is rarely obvious. It usually begins softly, not with anger, not with threats, but with sadness. "You used to be so caring. You used to understand me. I miss the old you." At first, it sounds loving, but underneath is a hidden message. Return to who you were when you were easier to control. And your brain, trained to value harmony, hears this as loss. You begin to mourn a version of yourself that was praised, even if that version was exhausted, anxious, constantly overgiving. So you soften your boundary. You explain more than necessary. You reopen conversations you had already closed. And slowly, the line you drew begins to blur. Not because you were wrong, but because guilt feels heavier than pain. Some manipulators never attack directly. Instead, they suffer loudly. They become fragile, silent, withdrawn. They sigh more, speak less, look wounded. Not necessarily fake, but strategically displayed. And suddenly you feel responsible for their sadness. Ask yourself quietly, did their sadness begin when you hurt them, or when you stopped abandoning yourself? When emotional pressure isn't enough, the past enters the conversation. "After everything I've done for you, I was there when nobody else was. You owe me more than this." Suddenly, your history feels like debt. Moments of kindness become chains. Acts of support become contracts you never signed. Guilt is powerful because it attacks your identity, not your logic, not your evidence, your identity. You don't want to be selfish. You don't want to hurt people. You don't want to be cold. Inside awakened people, two voices begin fighting. The first voice says, "Be understanding. They're struggling too." You know they didn't mean it. The second voice whispers, "You were drowning. You were disappearing. You were not safe." But the deepest guilt doesn't come from others. It comes from your own memory of who you used to be. You remember how much you tolerated, how long you stayed, how deeply you invested. And when you finally step away, you feel like you abandoned the person you once were. That younger version of you who believed love required sacrifice, who believed patience would change people. Here is the quiet truth. Many awakened people discover too late. Guilt does not mean you are wrong. It means you are doing something unfamiliar. After years of conditioning, your nervous system confuses self-protection with danger, because for years, your safety depended on pleasing others. Many manipulators never say, "You must stay," instead. They create invisible rules. You must always explain yourself. You must prioritize their emotions. You must forgive quickly. You must tolerate discomfort silently. Notice something. Did they ever feel guilty for hurting you? The way you feel guilty for protecting yourself? Eventually, there comes a moment when guilt and clarity collide. Maybe it's a conversation where you realize nothing has changed. Maybe it's a relapse into old patterns that leaves you emotionally numb. Maybe it's the exhaustion of explaining the same boundary again and again and again. Here's the paradox of awakening. You don't become colder, you become clearer. You don't stop caring. You stop carrying what never belonged to you. And slowly the guilt transforms from a signal of wrongdoing into a reminder that you are rewriting old survival scripts. But here's the twist nobody warns you about. Once you stop feeling guilty, some people don't just feel hurt, they feel threatened. And when guilt stops working, new tactics appear, subtle attacks on your credibility, quiet attempts to rewrite your story, whispers that question your stability, your memory, your motives. Because when you no longer feel guilty, control must find a new door. And in the next episode, we step into one of the most dangerous stages of awakening, character assassination, when the manipulator rewrites who you are to others and to yourself. And by the time you notice it happening, your identity may already be under attack. Now, you learned how guilt can be a cage, how protecting yourself can feel like betrayal, how the quiet withdrawal from manipulation can unleash storms you weren't prepared for. But the danger doesn't stop there, because when guilt fails to control you, manipulators escalate. Not loudly, not obviously, not with confrontation. They attack your identity, your reputation, your memory, the very story you tell yourself about who you are. Have you ever noticed how a few words repeated in the right way can change the way people see you? How a subtle insinuation, a half-forgotten story, a careful exaggeration can make you look like the villain, even to yourself. Tonight, we step into the arena of character assassination, where control moves from emotional manipulation to rewriting reality itself, and where the stakes are no longer comfort, but your sense of self. Character assassination is rarely loud. It is not a shouting match in public. It does not rely on obvious lies. Instead, it uses whispered insinuations, carefully timed omissions, and subtle contradictions. A manipulator might say, "You always overreacted, remember? That never happened the way you think." People get confused around you sometimes, or even, "I hope you're remembering correctly." It's easy to misinterpret things, and the effect is immediate. You start doubting your own memory, your perception begins to wobble, and before long, you begin questioning your reactions. Was I too harsh? Was I imagining it? Did I actually hurt them? Unintentionally. And here is the crucial part. Even if you never behaved wrongfully, your nervous system interprets the uncertainty as threat. Cognitive psychology shows that repeated memory questioning undermines confidence. When reality feels inconsistent, your mind seeks alignment, your self-image becomes malleable, and your internal narrative begins bending toward the story others tell. Combine this with social reputation attacks. He's not reliable, she's sensitive. They get defensive easily, repeated subtly, consistently, with emotional undertones. Your circle starts observing. Your allies begin hesitating. Even strangers notice a difference in how you are perceived. And internally, the effect is even more dangerous. You begin apologizing. Preemptively, you second-guess your instincts. You weigh every decision, as if your value depends on external approval. And here's the cruelest part. When awareness rises, you notice the pattern. You see it happening. But exposure alone doesn't stop the subtle erosion, because the manipulator has trained your system for hyper-alertness and self-doubt. And the very awareness amplifies the internal tension. Character assassination doesn't just target your reputation. It infiltrates your internal voice. You misremembered. You're too sensitive. You probably misunderstood. These phrases echo not only from the manipulator's lips, but inside your own mind. And suddenly, self-doubt is no longer external. It becomes internalized. You correct yourself. You soften your reactions. You edit your memories unconsciously, even when nothing was wrong. Your internal narrative, the story you tell yourself about yourself, is being rewritten. And this is when identity erosion and reputation control merge, because now, your authentic self is under siege, both inside and outside. The manipulator doesn't only want you doubting yourself. They want others doubting you too. They plant seeds of perception. I hope you understand why I had to. She can be dramatic sometimes. Don't take it personally to outsiders. It sounds innocent, maybe even justified. But the subtext is precise. You are unreliable. You are unstable. You are someone to be questioned. and slowly your social credibility starts eroding. Colleagues, friends, even family notice the inconsistencies, not knowing the subtle orchestration behind them. And now the manipulation is multi-layered. 1. Internal self-doubt. 2. Social credibility erosion. 3. Behavioral predictability to maintain appearance. By the time you realize it, your world has subtly shifted, and you're already adjusting again instinctively. You may ask yourself, am I overreacting? Am I imagining these patterns? Am I responsible for how people see me? Your internal debate becomes exhausting because every interaction carries weight, every statement is analyzed, every memory re-examined, and yet, stepping away doesn't feel safe either. The manipulator is patient. They understand that the long game is slower, quieter, almost invisible, and the tension silently grows. Many people at this stage experience deep anxiety, fear of being misunderstood, fear of social isolation, fear of being labeled unstable, and that fear is amplified by internalized guilt from episode 7. Now the awakened person faces a new paradox: trust your instincts and risk social friction, adapt to preserve peace, and risk identity erosion. Your nervous system constantly evaluates safety, and the manipulator is always one step ahead, subtly nudging choices. The manipulator uses predictable yet invisible tactics. Misrepresentation of your statements. I thought you said, instead of quoting you. Selective omission of context, emphasizing minor flaws, repeatedly questioning your perception in private conversations, leveraging witnesses or third-parties subtly, and each tactic is designed to maintain control without overt confrontation. Your brain responds automatically. Doubt, apology, hypervigilance, and every step reinforces the manipulator's invisible authority. Ask yourself, if everyone around me sees a different version of me, and I'm doubting myself, who am I really in this scenario? Awakening here requires strategic detachment. Observe without reacting. Record facts, not interpretations. Separate perception from emotional reaction. Reclaim your narrative silently. This stage is brutal because it often feels isolating. You can't rely on the same social validation as before. You must reconstruct your internal authority quietly, and every small victory is a step toward reclaiming your identity. Tonight, you've seen how manipulators can control the world around you by controlling how others perceive you and how you perceive yourself. But there is one final layer, even deeper than guilt, even deeper than reputation, even deeper than internalized doubt. The manipulator can control your emotional triggers without touching you. They can make your memories feel false. They can turn your mind against you in ways so subtle, most people never notice. In the next layer, we explore the silent trigger network, the hidden emotional levers manipulators use to predict, provoke, and control your reactions before you even speak. And this is where the mind game becomes almost invisible. Now, we saw how manipulators quietly attack your identity. They rewrite memories, distort reality, and subtly influence how others see you. By the time you notice, your mind has already shifted. Tonight, we go deeper, much deeper, because some of the most insidious manipulation happens before you even react. Before a word is spoken, before a gesture is made, it happens in your nervous system. In the split-second predictions your brain makes, in the microsecond reactions that determine your thoughts, your emotions, and your behavior. This is the silent trigger network, a web of anticipation, a map of your emotional landscape, and a subtle, invisible toolkit designed to provoke, control, and predict your every move. And yet, most people never see it. Most people never realize that every emotional spike, every sudden doubt, every unexplained agitation can be anticipated and exploited. Tonight, you will. Manipulators are masters of anticipatory psychology. They know your triggers, your insecurities, your emotional reflexes, your automatic reactions, and they use this knowledge without speaking a word. A subtle look, a half-remembered phrase, a pause just long enough to create tension. All of these micro-actions act as levers, silently pulling your nervous system into predictable responses. Your fear, your defensiveness, your confusion, even your empathy. It is a network of invisible cues, carefully designed so that you react exactly how they anticipate every time. Cognitive science explains this as predictive processing. Your brain constantly anticipates outcomes. It runs simulations of what will happen if I say this, do this, or think this. It predicts emotional and social consequences, often before you consciously decide. Manipulators exploit this. They don't confront you outright. They create conditions that guide your brain's predictions, so you act without realizing you were guided. You feel like you're making choices, but those choices are preconditioned, and every small reaction reinforces the manipulator's model. So the network becomes more accurate, more predictive, more controlling. Let's illustrate this. A delayed reply, a lingering silence, a tone of voice that is neutral but ambiguous. Each of these tiny signals triggers an emotional loop in you. Anxiety, did I say something wrong? Doubt, am I being unreasonable? Urgency, I need to fix this now. Before you know it, your emotional state has shifted. Your decisions are influenced. Your focus is on them, not yourself. And the manipulator observes, patiently, silently, noting which triggers produce the strongest response. It is a feedback loop you rarely see, but it is profoundly effective. Notice something. Your reactions feel spontaneous, but they are often pre-scripted by their understanding of your mind. Every spike of anger, sadness, or fear is anticipated and used. The silent trigger network is most dangerous because it eventually enters your own mind. You anticipate their manipulations. You preemptively correct yourself. You suppress your own needs to avoid triggering tension. And soon, your self-regulation is no longer for your benefit, but to prevent predictable conflict. The manipulator may not even speak. You've already learned their pattern. You've internalized the network. And suddenly, control feels invisible, inescapable, silent. At this stage, emotional exhaustion is inevitable. You feel drained without confrontation. You feel anxious without reason. You feel guilt without a clear trigger, because your brain is constantly navigating invisible levers. Every interaction is evaluated, measured, simulated, and most of your energy goes into avoiding predicted conflict. Even if you don't realize it, you are living in a carefully constructed predictive cage. Ask yourself quietly, how often do I react spontaneously versus how often do I react to avoid anticipated tension? The first step in dismantling the silent trigger network is observation. Notice when your body reacts before conscious thought. Observe the emotional spikes without immediate action. Record patterns. Which words, tones, silences, or gestures consistently provoke you? Awareness is your map. Recognition is your compass. And patience is your shield. Once you can track the triggers, you start regaining choice. You can decide, respond, ignore, or disengage. You can choose whether the emotional lever controls you or you control yourself. Reclaiming your mind from the silent trigger network requires 1. Identifying predictability. Notice the scenarios where your responses are automatic. 2. Interrupting the pattern. Pause, breathe, and observe before reacting. 3. Restoring autonomy. Make deliberate choices based on values, not anticipation. 4. Rebuilding internal authority. Your emotions belong to you, not the manipulator. It is not easy, it is exhausting, it is sometimes lonely. But every small step weakens the network, reduces their predictive power, and restores your inner freedom. Imagine this. A situation arises where previously you would have reacted, triggered by silence, tone, or delay. Instead, you pause, you breathe, you respond deliberately, you choose your response, not your anticipation. That moment, subtle yet profound, signals that the network is weakening. The invisible leash is loosening, and for the first time, control feels like yours. Tonight, You've seen how manipulators map your mind, predict your reactions, and pull invisible levers to influence behavior, silently. But there is one final challenge. Even after you regain autonomy, manipulators escalate again. They combine emotional, social, and cognitive tactics simultaneously to test your boundaries, your patience, and your perception. In the next layer, we uncover the triple threat manipulation, the combined use of guilt, triggers, and social distortion, and why it can shake even the most awakened minds. And by the time you notice it, the web is already woven, and the test of autonomy begins. Now, we explored the silent trigger network, the way manipulators predict your reactions, provoke emotions before you even realize it, and subtly influence your decisions. Tonight, the stakes rise, because manipulators rarely rely on just one tactic. They combine strategies. They layer control mechanisms. They weave emotional, cognitive, and social influence together simultaneously. This is the triple threat, a system designed to destabilize, confuse, and manipulate even the most aware minds, and it is relentless, silent, and often invisible. Tonight, we step inside the web. We watch how the gears turn, and we learn how to dismantle. We have met guilt before. It is subtle, it is personal, it attacks your identity. But in the triple threat, guilt becomes amplified and strategic. You set a boundary. They make you feel selfish. You pursue independence. They remind you of past sacrifices. You speak your truth. They imply betrayal. It's no longer about feelings. It's about control through obligation. Guilt becomes the first lever of the network. It makes you question your morality, your loyalty, your own worth. And while guilt works, it's only effective when combined with triggers and social distortion. Triggers are the micro-actions that provoke emotional responses. A pause in conversation, a subtle tone shift, a small omission, a reminder of past mistakes. By themselves, triggers are small, harmless to the untrained observer. But when guilt is already in play, triggers activate your anxiety, self-doubt, and overcompensation. Your brain anticipates the manipulator's intentions. Your nervous system reacts automatically, and your emotions become predictable, malleable, and controllable. The final piece is the social dimension. Manipulators rarely act alone. They involve witnesses, friends, colleagues, family, subtly. I hope you understand why I had to, whispered to a third party. She tends to overreact sometimes in casual conversation. I tried explaining, but you know how sensitive they can be. These statements are carefully designed. They distort how others see you and reshape your social reality. Suddenly, your credibility is questioned, your reputation wavers, your social support feels unstable, and inside your self-doubt skyrockets. Because now, you are fighting against guilt, internal triggers, and external perception all at once. Notice the pattern. 1. Guilt destabilizes your internal moral compass. 2. Triggers provoke predictable emotional reactions. 3. Social distortion undermines your credibility externally. Individually, each is powerful. Together, they form a self-reinforcing cycle, a network of control that is almost invisible until you see it fully. Cognitive science shows that the triple threat works because it attacks 3 interdependent systems. 1. Internal self-perception guilt. An anxiety. You question your own memory. You anticipate emotional manipulation. You doubt how others perceive your actions. And your energy, your focus, your emotional resilience is consumed almost entirely by maintaining equilibrium in the network. Inside awakened people, a storm builds. Am I overreacting? Am I imagining this? Am I damaging relationships by protecting myself? Your nervous system stays hyper-alert. Your attention fragments, your confidence wavers. Even small interactions feel like tests. Every pause, every tone, every word, a potential trap, and you may feel trapped, not by overt control, but by the anticipation of manipulation in every moment. The first step to breaking the triple threat is recognition. Observe the triggers without immediate reaction. Identify guilt patterns without accepting blame. Detect social distortion without internalizing it. Step 2. Mapping the network. Record emotional spikes and their causes. Notice where guilt triggers and social perception converge. Build an internal guide to predict manipulation, consciously rather than unconsciously. Step 3. Intentional response. Pause before reacting. Choose your boundaries deliberately. Communicate clearly, but without unnecessary justification. Each small action weakens the network. Each deliberate choice restores autonomy. This is the hardest stage. You may feel socially isolated. You may feel misunderstood. You may feel guilt resurface as if returning automatically. The manipulator knows your patterns. The network relies on repetition. Your mind instinctively reacts. But with awareness, you intervene in the cycle. You stop the automatic response. You reclaim your emotional energy. Reclaiming autonomy against the triple threat requires 1. Recognition. See the layers of guilt, triggers, and social distortion. 2. Pause. Interrupt automatic reactions. 3. Boundary enforcement. Reinforce limits without over-explaining. 4. Rebuilding internal authority. Trust your memory, judgment, and perception. Each step dismantles the manipulator's invisible scaffolding and rebuilds your sense of self. Tonight, you've seen the full system: emotional leverage through guilt, predictive emotional triggers, social perception manipulation. The triple threat is the pinnacle of subtle control and the ultimate test of awareness. But there is one last frontier. Even after mastering recognition and response, manipulators may escalate into covert aggression, combining deception, pressure, and emotional sabotage at the highest level. In the next episode, we step into the final stage of awakening, the subtle war, where control is no longer obvious, but every thought, memory, and emotion is tested, and the awakened mind must defend itself completely. So far, you've seen the layers: guilt that traps you in self-blame, silent triggers that provoke emotions before you act, social distortion that rewrites how others see you. You've learned to observe, pause, and reclaim autonomy. But manipulators do not give up. They escalate. They test the limits of your awareness. This is the subtle war. A conflict fought not with words, but with invisible moves, covert pressure, and psychological precision. Tonight, you will understand how far manipulation can reach and how awakening requires more than awareness. It requires strategy, patience, and emotional resilience. Because in this war, every thought, every emotion, every memory is a potential battlefield. The subtle war begins quietly. Small contradictions, misaligned statements, micro failures in communication. At first, they feel like coincidences, minor annoyances, misunderstandings. But these microaggressions serve a single purpose: test boundaries. Your reactions are analyzed. Your confidence is observed. Your emotional patterns are recorded. Even the slightest slip, a flare of frustration, a hint of defensiveness, becomes data for the manipulator. They are conducting psychological reconnaissance without drawing attention to themselves. And here is the cruelest part. You often recognize the pattern only after it has already affected you. High-level manipulation is never random. It combines the tactics you have learned. Guilt reappears, stronger, more strategic. Silent triggers push emotional responses exactly when they will destabilize you. Social distortion amplifies uncertainty, making you question allies, peers, even family. All three interact in real time, creating overlapping pressure points. Your mind feels constantly tested. Should you defend yourself? Should you retreat? Should you maintain the relationship or protect your autonomy? The manipulator watches patiently, knowing that every choice, hesitation, and response reveals your strengths and weaknesses. This is where advanced manipulation enters the covert war zone. Cognitive load increases as you juggle internal and external threats. Emotional regulation is constantly challenged by unpredictable triggers. Self-perception is destabilized by subtle contradictions and social cues. Your nervous system reacts, anxiety rises, your brain overcompensates, hypervigilance sets in. Your emotions run in loops, frustration, doubt, guilt. And yet, to survive this war, you must act without showing vulnerability, not externally, not internally. Because in this subtle war, any sign of weakness, real or perceived, is immediately exploited. Observe carefully. Every interaction becomes a test. Every word is analyzed. Every emotion is a potential lever for manipulation. And your challenge? Respond strategically without surrendering your mind. This is the battlefield of the awakened. Inside you, two opposing forces battle. 1. The instinct to react, fight, flee, justify, correct. 2. The strategic observer, pause, analyze, measure, respond deliberately. The subtle war forces you into this internal duel constantly. Every decision is high stakes. Every emotional flare is a potential misstep, and every pattern in your behavior is a map for the manipulator. Your goal is clear. Maintain control over your mind and identity while navigating a world rigged to destabilize both. Surviving the subtle war requires advanced techniques, emotional armor. Maintain calm, detach from immediate provocation. Cognitive clarity, track reality carefully, distinguish facts from insinuation. Social calibration, protect relationships without over-explaining or apologizing unnecessarily. Boundary reinforcement, state limits clearly and consistently, without justification. Each technique weakens the manipulator's network. Each technique reclaims territory in your mental and emotional space, and each small victory accumulates, slowly dismantling the subtle war's leverage. Despite awareness, the subtle war is exhausting. Emotional spikes feel constant. Memory doubts resurface. Social uncertainty creates tension. You may feel isolated. You may feel anxious. You may feel guilty, even when you have done nothing wrong. But these sensations are symptoms of liberation. They signal that the manipulator is adjusting, because you are no longer fully predictable. Awakening is not peaceful. It is hard, disorienting, and profoundly transformative. Step by step, you reclaim power. 1. Observation without reaction. Notice triggers and social distortions. 2. Deliberate response. Act according to values, not anticipation. 3. Internal authority. Trust your memory, perception, and instincts. 4. Boundary consistency. Enforce limits without guilt or overcompensation. Each step weakens the subtle war, reduces its predictive power, and restores your autonomy. Imagine this scenario. You are provoked with guilt. A silent trigger activates tension. Social distortion creates uncertainty around your credibility. And yet, you remain calm. You pause. You observe. You respond deliberately. The manipulator's levers fail. The network of control falters. Your mind, your emotions, your identity remain intact. For the first time, the subtle war is no longer invisible, and the awakening is complete. Tonight, you have seen the full spectrum of high-level manipulation. Emotional leverage, predictive triggers, social distortion, the overlapping triple threat, and the subtle war itself. But there is one final chapter in this season, even after mastering awareness and defense. Manipulators may escalate to the ultimate level. Combined emotional, cognitive, and social sabotage at scale, testing your autonomy, integrity, and identity to the limit. In the next layer, we explore the final confrontation, mastering your mind in the face of complete manipulation. And when it ends, you will understand the last step in reclaiming freedom from silent manipulation, fully, permanently. So far, you've survived the triple threat. You've witnessed guilt's grip, silent triggers' precision, and the distortion of social perception. You've navigated the subtle war, defended your internal autonomy, and started reclaiming your mind. But tonight, the game changes. This is the final confrontation, the ultimate escalation, where the manipulator uses every tool simultaneously. Emotional, cognitive, and social tactics combined in real time. The stakes are no longer just peace of mind. They are identity, integrity, freedom, And for the first time, the awakened must step fully into mastery of their own mind. Because if you falter now, even the smallest slip can undo months of awareness and strategy. The manipulator now merges every prior tactic. Guilt is weaponized with precision, targeting your deepest insecurities. Silent triggers provoke your emotional reflexes at peak vulnerability. Social distortion is amplified, creating perceived isolation, misunderstanding, and misrepresentation. Every interaction becomes a multi-layered test. Every word, glance, and silence is designed to measure your limits. Every reaction feeds the manipulator's model of your mind. And yet, this is your moment. This is where awareness transforms into mastery. Step 1. Recognize the escalation. Your body reacts instantly to manipulative cues. Your mind anticipates triggers before they occur. Your social environment subtly shifts against you. Notice it, label it, observe it without immediate reaction. Awareness here is your first weapon. The manipulator relies on automatic responses. If you respond consciously, deliberately, the network falters. Your mind is no longer a battlefield. It becomes a command center. Now you combine all defensive strategies learned. 1. Emotional armor: maintain calm despite provocation. 2. Cognitive clarity: separate facts from insinuations. Track reality without distortion. 3. Social calibration: respond to social attacks without defensiveness or over-justification. 4. Boundary reinforcement: assert limits consistently and calmly. 5. Internal authority: trust your memory, perception, and instincts. Each layer strengthens your autonomy. Each deliberate choice weakens the manipulator's predictive power. Each victory is cumulative and irreversible. Imagine this. A manipulative, guilt-laden comment appears. A silent trigger nudges emotional tension. Third-party perception challenges your credibility. And for the first time, you pause, you breathe, you respond deliberately. The manipulator's levers fail. The triple threat collapses under your mastery of observation and response. This is the turning point. You are no longer reacting to manipulation. You are choosing your actions, emotions, and narrative. At this stage, mastery becomes psychological freedom. You distinguish guilt, that is manipulation, from genuine moral responsibility. You detect triggers but respond consciously, breaking the automatic cycle. You rebuild social credibility on your terms, independent of distortion. The manipulator can test endlessly, but your autonomy is now self-reinforcing. Their predictions fail because your mind is no longer predictable. Your emotional system is resilient. Your identity is intact. This is not revenge. It is empowerment. It is freedom within the boundaries of your own mind. Even after mastery, residual tension remains. Minor triggers may surface. Old guilt patterns may attempt to resurface. Social distortions may still occur. And yet, you have learned to observe, pause, and choose. You have built internal authority that no manipulator can override. You have cultivated a mind immune to silent control. And here, awareness turns into permanent resilience. Visualize this final confrontation. The manipulator attempts all levers simultaneously. Your emotional armor remains intact. Your mind observes without reacting automatically. You respond strategically and deliberately. The invisible network collapses. The manipulator's predictive model fails. And for the first time, you are fully sovereign in your own mind. Ask yourself, which part of my mind had been unconsciously responding to others' influence? Where can I reclaim authority over my emotions, memories, and social interactions? How will I maintain this sovereignty in future subtle manipulations? Awareness alone was not enough. Action, observation, strategy, and resilience were required. And now you have. Tonight, your journey from awareness to mastery is complete. But like any battlefield, vigilance is eternal. Manipulators will always exist. Triggers may still appear. Social distortion may recur. Yet with the tools you now carry, you are prepared. Your mind is your fortress. Your identity is your shield. Your emotions are your allies. The journey does not truly end here. Take a moment to reflect. You have navigated the hidden traps, seen through the silent manipulations, and reclaimed control of your mind. You have faced the subtle wars of influence and emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware. If this audiobook opened your eyes to the unseen forces shaping thoughts and emotions, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe so you never miss these deep dives into the hidden workings of the human mind. Your awareness is your power, and every step you take strengthens it. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, your mind is yours to protect.